This is the straitjacket that Barack Obama donned when he exited the campaign and entered history. The constraints he inherited were multiple. First, during the campaign, he had proposed a bill to the Senate known as the Iraq War De-Escalation Act of 2007 for complete withdrawal by March 2008. Okay. Done that, been there, no, it's not happened. But he found once he was in office that he had to withdraw in a way that once again maintained the credibility of the U.S. as reliable, even in occupation. His own reputation as a steady, process-oriented leader rather than a fickle brute, unwilling to put back together the nation we had disassembled. And so Obama, who vehemently opposed the 2007 surge as the needless, costly, and terrible consequence of a failed policy, essentially implemented the policy set out by President George Bush, gradually drawing down troops according to the timeline previously negotiated with Iraq. The overarching goal before and after the election of 2008, to tamp down the internecine warfare long enough for the Iraqi government to implement a new constitution and the U.S. to exit, with some semblance of accomplishment. A modern, better version of what Richard Nixon called peace with honor. This task was important not only to the image and credibility of the United States, it should be noted, but to the sense of integrity, the sense of accomplishment of all the participants in the war in Iraq, a coalition that drew together 49 countries from 4 continents, 5 of which contributed troops: U.S., UK, Australia, Poland, and Denmark. These governments also had local constituents to whom they had to answer. A messy ending to the war would let them all down, as well as the peoples of Iraq. Secondly, Obama found himself in the midst of a war in Afghanistan, a conflict America did not seek, he said in his address to the Nobel Prize Committee, and quote, one in which we are joined by 43 other countries, including Norway. Just last month, the president approved a new surge in Afghanistan, one not greatly different from the 2000 surge in Iraq, deploying 30,000 new troops in the NATO-led international security force in that conflict-stricken nation. Unlike Bush, President Obama set a deadline for withdrawal within 18 months. Of course, such deadlines can be changed at will, and they frequently are. The plan was what the Wall Street Journal called the middle path between Obama's generals and his civilian advisors. John McCain criticized the president for setting a firm deadline for withdrawal, and this really just echoed the debates we heard continuously over the last several years during the Bush administration about whether it's more strategic to give local allies a deadline, or is it better to keep local insurgents guessing about how long we'll stay. Simultaneously, the Obama administration made known its displeasure with Iraq for failing to suppress, Pakistan, for failing to suppress international terrorist attacks originating in its territory, and has hinted at the possibility of taking the war across Pakistan's borders. These are but 2 examples of the difficult problems facing Obama, who finds himself in the same position as George Bush. Other issues include nuclear proliferation, human rights enforcement, irredentism in Eastern Europe, China, the Middle East, and of course, global warming and economic meltdown. What makes these issues, however, so intractable, especially those associated with security, is the fact, that the U.S. remains the go-to government in times of international crisis. Obama differs from his predecessor, yes he does, in his oft-expressed desire to cooperate as much as possible with the international community, to dialogue more thoroughly before deploying strategic assets. He appears to recognize more clearly than Bush did the limits on the ability of the U.S. to fix problems. In fact, he said in his Nobel speech, the most we can hope to do is to, quote, bend history, bend it in the direction of justice. But it's important to recognize that prior to the destruction of World Trade Towers by Al-Qaeda, the Bush administration said much the same thing. Condoleezza Rice warned in 2000 during the Bush campaign, quote, using the American armed forces as the world's 9/11 will degrade capabilities, bog soldiers down in peacekeeping roles, and fuel concern among other great powers that the United States has decided to enforce notions of limited sovereignty worldwide in the name of humanitarianism. This overly broad definition of America's national interest is bound to backfire, unquote. The Bush administration, in other words, also emphasized the limits of U.S. power and responsibility, but George Bush, like Barack Obama today, ultimately felt compelled to intervene when the cost of not doing so was the credibility of the U.S. as a nation prepared to defend its own borders and the security of the international system. When Obama said just a couple of weeks ago in Oslo, quote, "Those who claim to respect international law cannot avert their eyes when it's flouted," he eerily echoed the statements of Colin Powell, arguing for the enforcement of a decade's worth of international resolutions chastising Iraq for non-compliance with weapons inspectors. Indeed, and this is, in fact, the fundamental conundrum that has dogged every single American president since 1945, and that's the enforcement of the international laws established at the end of World War II. From that point forward, states bound themselves around the world voluntarily to international rules with regard to war, property, and human rights. In numerous negotiated pacts, conquest was prohibited, and limits were placed on the legal right of states to abuse their own populations. The development of international law, of course, raised the question of enforcement. You don't have law unless you have enforcement. And the U.S. was consistently the country most likely to assume burdens outside its own borders. This was least controversial when it was about cross-border aggression, such as Iraq's attempted takeover of Kuwait in 1990, or even North Korea's surprise invasion of South Korea in 1950. Enforcement was most controversial when interventions sought to reshape domestic events. Indeed, the very first principle of the post-war international order, the sanctity of international borders, national self-determination, was contradicted by the second principle, respect for basic human rights, as they were set out in the 1948 Universal Declaration. This second principle implied accountability to global standards concerning domestic behavior. Individual states found themselves under collective scrutiny, but enforcement